Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Give us another 5 minutes so that we will be starting the session. So still students are logging. So give us another 5 minutes.
Okay, sir.
പേര് പറഞ്ഞേ. ധർമ്മഹീതം മല്ലൻ പുള്ളുവനെ. Okay, good evening to all. Am I audible?
Good evening, sir. Yes, okay, sir.
Right, okay. So basically, warm welcome to the revision program. So basically, the free revision program. So we are intending to cover several key standards today with regard to the advanced audit and assurance syllabus. We are the subject, and I have basically they have uploaded the small short note as well, which I have drafted for the benefit of all the students who are joining today. Despite whether you are coming to JMC or whether you are going to any other institute. So our objective is to see all of you are passing the exam. So therefore, I have drafted a small short note which comprises of several slides. So that is basically free of charge, and it has been I think uploaded to the Zoom platform so that you can keep that with yourself as a studies text. Right. So basically, our objective is to cover several standards, key standards today while using a few mind maps. So basically, when you look at from the broader perspective, let me summarize the standards which we are going to cover today. So basically, we will be covering SLA US 200. Then we will be covering SLA US 240, which is fraud and errors. Then we will be covering SLA US 500. That is audit evidence. Then we will be covering SLUS 570 going concern. Then we will be covering SLUS 560, which is subsequent events. Then we will be covering SLAUS 230, which is audit documentation. Then SLAUS 505, external confirmations. Then finally, we will be touching upon SLUS 580, which is written representation. So basically, these are the main standards which I'm intending to cover through this revision program. So this program will continue for a period of 1.5 hours. So I'm not in a position to discuss all this stuff in detail like the way we discuss in our theory class. But I'll try to summarize as much as possible, and you are free to talk. And if you need any, if you have any clarifications or if you have any questions, so that you are free to talk when the session goes on. Right. Okay. So we'll start from SLAS 200. Okay. So we'll start from SLAS 200, which is basically the auditor's responsibility, where we talk about the ethical requirements. Right. So when you talk about SLAS 200, basically we are talking about the ethical requirements. We are talking about the ethical requirements which is applicable to the auditor. So SLAS 200 basically summarize the ethical requirements which is applicable to the auditor. So in the theory class, basically we had a deep dive with regard to all the ethical requirements. So let me summarize the ethical requirements in brief. So the first ethical requirement which is applicable for the auditor is considered as independence. Independence. So what do you mean by independence? In simple language, independence is the auditor's ability. It is the auditor's ability to express an unbiased audit opinion. It is the auditor's ability to express an unbiased audit opinion is defined as what? Independence. So independence basically segregated into two parameters. Number one, auditor has to have physical independence. Then number two, the auditor has to have mental independence as well. Mental independence. භෞතික ස්වාධීනත්වය සහ මානසික ස්වාධීනත්වය. So the aggregation of physical and mental independence is defined as what? Complete independence. Complete independence. Right. All these things are summarized in the slide which I shared with you all, so that you can turn to that slide as well. So then specifically we talk about the factors. Specifically we talk about the factors which has a negative impact which has a negative impact to independence. So there basically we discuss about 5 factors. We basically discuss about 5 factors. Number 1, if the auditor involves in the management decision making process. If the auditor is involved in the management decision making process, it is a point where you will be having a question mark with regard to the independence. Then number 2, auditor. If the auditor is going to accept an employment opportunity of the client, again it is a situation where you will be facing to a threat in relation to independence. Number 3, if the auditor is having any financial intervention or financial interest, it is a situation where you will be having a question mark with regard to independence. Then, if the auditor is having a close or family relationship with the client, which is considered as a threat to independence. Finally, if the auditor's income, a major portion of the auditor's income received from one client, if major portion of auditor's income received from one client is considered as a instance where you have a threat to independence. So basically these are the main threats which we discuss in our theory class. We discuss on these very deeply. So these are the threats which identified as the factors which will create a significant doubt with regard to the independence of the auditor. So that will create an impact to physical independence as well as for mental independence as well. Then apart from that, we discuss several other ethical requirements as well. So number 2, we discuss about integrity. Number 3, we discuss about objectivity. Right. So then we specifically discuss, even though integrity and objectivity are considered as 2 different ethics, all these 2 ethics are interrelated. Integrity and objectivity is interrelated. Right. Then we discuss about another ethical requirement, which is basically professional competence and due care. Professional competence and due care. So the auditor should have the professional competence. Auditor should evaluate himself or herself with regard to the ability to accept the assurance engagement. So prior to accepting an assurance engagement, auditor has to evaluate himself or herself. That is what you referred as professional competence. And once you accepted the assurance engagement, you need to perform that assurance engagement with utmost due care. So that is what you referred as professional competence and due care. Then we discuss about confidentiality. Another frequent ethical requirement which has been tested frequently at the exam. Right. When you talk about confidentiality, we discuss about several things. Number 1, we discuss about auditor is having unlimited access to any information of the company. Audit is having unlimited access to any information which is applicable to the business organization in relation to the audit. While using this unlimited access, auditor can obtain sensitive informations. While using this authority, unlimited access, auditor can obtain what? sensitive information. All these sensitive informations, number one, should not be used for the personal advantage. Should not be used for the personal advantage. That is number one. Number two, should not be handed over. Should not be handed over to any other party for their advantage as well. For their personal advantage as well. Number three, if auditor handed over the information to any other party, for any other reason, that is basically not the personal advantage, still needs to obtain the approval. Obtain the approval from the client. Auditor cannot use those informations for their personal advantage. Neither the auditor is having the ability to hand over all these information to the personal advantage of a third party. But if the auditor is going to hand over those information to a third party for any other reason other than the personal advantage, still the auditor has to seek the approval from whom? Approval from the management. But for confidentiality, we discuss about few exception rules. We discuss about few exception rules as well. So in our class, we discuss about 4 exception rules. 4 exception rules. So those are the main things which we discuss under confidentiality. Finally, so the final ethical requirement which is applicable to the auditor is what? It's professional behavior. Professional behavior. So SLAS 200 is basically had a deep dive with regard to all these ethical requirements. So in simple language, there are 5 ethical requirements. 6 ethical requirements where the auditor needs to comply with. Number 1, it's independence. Number 2, it's integrity. Number 3 is objectivity. Number 4, professional competence and due care. Then number 5 is confidentiality. And number 6 is basically professional behavior. Right? Are we clear on this? Are we clear on this?
Yes, sir.
Okay, then we discuss about threats. We discuss about threats. Which has a negative impact for the ethical requirements. So there are several threats which has a negative impact for the ethical requirements. So the first threat we discuss, that is basically self-interest. We discuss about self-interest. Number 2, self-review. Number 3, familiarity threat. Number 4, advocacy threat. Number 5, intermediation threat. So those are the threats which we discuss with regard to the ethical requirements. So there are basically 5 threats. So you have self-interest, self-review, familiarity threat, advocacy threat, plus the intermediation threat. So those are the main 5 threats which will have a negative impact for the ethical requirements. These threats will create negative impact. Negative impact for ethical requirements. Okay. So this is basically the summary of SLAS 200. Okay, are we clear on this? Any questions? So if you do have any questions, you need to raise your voice. They have already shared the presentation slides. Okay, they will be sharing in the WhatsApp group as well. Okay, so any questions with regard to SLAS 200? Right. So basically we have already covered one standard. Right. Now we are going back to SLAS 240. So these are considered as mind maps. Okay, so these are considered as mind maps. So that these mind maps are very important for you to understand the theoretical aspects. Right. So you need to take one A4 paper for each and every auditing standard, and it's better if you can create a master mind map like that. Okay, so coming back to SLAS 240, which is basically fraud and errors. SLAS 240, which is basically frauds and errors, where I have given the short note as well. So fraud and errors I summarized into one slide where you will be having a master mind map. Right. So in simple language, fraud is defined as what? In simple language, fraud is defined as what? Fraud is considered as an intentional act. Intentional act. Then error is considered as what? It is considered as a mistake. It is considered as a mistake. Okay, so fraud is considered as an intentional act, whereas errors is considered as what? A mistake. So despite whether it is a fraud or an error, it will have a direct impact to what? Financial statements. It will have a direct impact to financial statements, despite whether it is a fraud or error, which will have a direct impact to the financial statements. And these financial statements are used by who? Are used by stakeholders. Stakeholders to take various types of economic decisions. Various types of economic decisions. So therefore, fraud and errors will have an indirect impact. Fraud and errors will have an indirect impact. Indirect impact to the stakeholders as well as for the economic decisions which the stakeholders are going to make. Then, when we wanted to learn the definition of fraud, basically we segregated the definition of fraud while asking three questions. Number one, who is doing a fraud? That is number one. Number two, why they are doing a fraud? And number three, how they are going to do the fraud. So the answer which you are getting for all these three questions define the definition of fraud as per SLAS 240, right? So there are four parties to be involved to the fraud. Who are the four parties? Number one, management. Number two, parties responsible for good governance. Parties responsible for good governance. Then number three, employees. And number four, third parties. So you got the answer for the first question. Who is doing a fraud? Management, parties who are responsible for the good governance, employees or third parties. Why they are doing the fraud? To obtain an unjustifiable or illegal advantage. How they are going to do the fraud? It's an intentional act. So the answer which you are getting for those three questions, who is doing the fraud, why they are doing a fraud, and how they are going to do the fraud, will give you the exact definition of a fraud as per the auditing standard number 240. So if someone is asking you, as specialist 240, what is the definition of a fraud? So what is the answer that you need to give? It is an intentional act done by management, parties who are responsible for good governance, employees or third parties to obtain an unjustifiable and illegal advantage. So that is the exact definition of a fraud as per the standard. So in that context, fraud basically segregated into two different parameters. Number one, misappropriation of assets. That is number one. Number two, fraudulent financial reporting. So in broader perspective, frauds are segregated into two different parameters: misappropriation of assets and fraudulent financial reporting. Then the concern arises, can the auditor identify all the frauds? Which prevails in the financial statement? So the definite answer for that question would be no. Audit is not responsible to identify all the frauds which prevails in the financials. However, auditor will be responsible to identify frauds which will leads to what? Which will leads to material misstatements in the financials. That is the keyword. Material misstatements in the financials. So audit is not expected to detect all the frauds which prevails in the financials. But however, auditor will be responsible to detect the frauds which will lead to what? Material misstatements in the financials. Then you need to ask the question, what do you mean by material misstatement? You need to ask the question, what do you mean by material misstatement? Material misstatement is a misstatement which will have a negative impact to the economic decisions of the intended users of the financial statements. Are we clear? So material misstatement is a misstatement which will have a negative impact, not a positive impact. ඍණාත්මක බලපෑමක් තියෙන negative impact to the economic decisions of the intended users of the financial statement. So who are the intended users of the financial statement? Stakeholders. Stakeholders are broadly categorized into two: internal stakeholders plus external stakeholders. එතකොට ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ ආර්ථිකමය තීරණයන්ට බලපාන වරදක් තියෙනවා නම් ඒක අපි කතා කරා මොකක් කියලා? ප්‍රමාණාත්මක සාවධතාවය කියලා. So the auditor will be responsible to identify the frauds which will lead to material misstatements in the financials. Are we clear? Right. Then when we talk about fraud and errors, we discuss about prevention and detection. Prevention and detection. We discuss about prevention of fraud and errors and detection of fraud and errors. Prevention and detection. So who will be the party directly responsible for the prevention and detection of fraud and errors? It is the management. Management is responsible for the prevention and detection of fraud and errors. Management will be responsible for the prevention and detection of fraud and errors. So therefore, the standard emphasizes the management to implement two things. Number one, management will be responsible to implement effective accounting and internal control system. Management will be responsible to implement a proper accounting and internal control system within the business organization. Number two, to have proper control environment. Proper control environment and control activities. Proper control environment and control activities. So we discuss on these two points in detail when we are discussing the standard in the class itself. Right, so the management will be responsible for the prevention and detection of fraud and errors. It is the direct responsibility of the management. So in order to do that, management has to establish two things. Number one, they need to implement a proper accounting and internal control system within the business organization. Number two, they need to have proper control environment and control activities within the business organization. So what I mean by control activities and control environment, we had a deep discussion in our classroom as well. So control activities, again further referred as what? Spam soap. In our physical and online class, we did have a deep dive on that. Then the concern arises, what is auditor's responsibility? We're going to cover it a වගකීමක් නැද්ද? With regard to fraud and errors, what is auditor's responsibility? What is auditor's responsibility? With regard to fraud and errors, what is auditor's responsibility? Auditor also having a responsibility. So in order to fulfill the responsibility of the auditor, the standard wanted the auditor to implement few procedures. Number one, to have regular discussions. Regular discussions with the audit team. As the auditors, you need to have a regular discussion with the audit team at regular intervals. Number two, you need to perform a proper risk assessment. You need to perform a proper risk assessment. So when you are performing the proper risk assessment as an auditor, you need to consider about what? Fraud risk factors. Then class එකට ආපු කට්ටිය මේව ටට්ටක් ගාලා මතකට ගන්න ඕන. We discuss about fraud risk factors. There are three fraud risk factors: opportunities, employees' attitudes, incentives, and pressure. So when you are doing the risk assessment, you need to consider about the fraud risk factors. Then number three, you need to make inquiries from management. You need to make inquiries from management. Management එන් ගිහලා අහන්න ඕන මොනවද වෙලා තිබිච්ච වැරදි හා වංචා මොනවද ඒවා බලපෑම්. You need to ask questions from the management. Finally, upon completing all these things, when you find an indication with regard to a fraud or an error, then you need to check the nature of the indication. That is very much important. Nature of the indication. Number two, possibility of indication convert into a reality. Finally, you need to check the impact to the financial statement. So those are the responsibilities which highlighted as per the standard with regard to the auditor's responsibility in relation to fraud and errors. Clear? Okay, so this will give you a overall understanding with regard to the SLS 240, which is fraud and errors. So are we clear on this?
Yes, sir.
Right, any questions? Any questions? So you're free to ask any questions if you need any further clarifications. Right. Okay, so we discussed two standards. 200 we discussed, then we discussed about 240. Right, before we go to 500, so let me summarize 570 as well, which is basically going concern. Which is basically going concern. SLA US 570 going concern. Right. Okay, few theoretical aspects which we need to cover under going concern as well. Number one, management prepares financial statements based on going concern assumption. Management prepare the financial statement based on what? Based on the going concern assumption. That is the key. Number two, therefore, the responsibility with regard to appropriateness of the going concern assumption, a keyword, appropriateness of the going concern assumption is a responsibility of whom? Is a responsibility of the management. So therefore the responsibility with regard to the appropriateness of the going concern assumption is with management. Now the concern arises. Then what is auditor's responsibility? මොකද්ද විගණකවරයාගේ වගකීම වෙන්නේ? Then what is auditor's responsibility? When we talk about auditor's responsibility in the standard, which has been segregated into three categories. Right? Number one, what is the first responsibility? To check whether there is a material uncertainty. With regard to the going concern assumption. So that is what the auditor's prime responsibility. So as an auditor, you need to check whether there is a material uncertainty with regard to the going concern assumption. So therefore the standard wanted the auditor to focus on financial indicators, then operational indicators, and other indicators. Which will create a significant doubt in the auditor's mind with regard to the company's ability to continue as going concern. So that's what the prime responsibility, the first responsibility of the auditor. That is number one. Then number two, auditor needs to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidences with regard to going concern. That is number two. Auditor has to obtain sufficient and appropriate audit evidences with regard to what? With regard to going concern. Number 3, what is the third responsibility? Number 3, evaluate the impact to the financial statements and to the audit opinion. To the audit opinion. So therefore, those are the main 3 responsibilities of the auditor with regard to the going concern assumption. Clear? So therefore, the standard very specifically highlighting the auditor, you will be having the responsibility to check the possibilities where the management responsibility with regard to going concern is having a question mark. Audit is having the responsibility to check the possibilities where the management responsibility with regard to the going concern assumption is having what? Question mark. So therefore, SLS 570 wanted the auditor. Therefore, SLS 570 wanted the auditor to focus on going concern throughout the audit. So therefore, the standard wanted the auditor to focus on the going concern assumption throughout the audit. So therefore, in the planning stage, number 2 in performing stage, and number 3 in review stage, auditor has to focus on what? Going concern assumption. Going concern assumption. Clear? Then the final segment which we discuss. Can the auditor reach to the final conclusion? Come to the final conclusion by just looking at the indicators? That is the question. Can the auditor reach to the final conclusion by just looking at the indication? Throughout the audit process, auditors have the responsibility to check these indicators, but the concern arises by just seeing an indication. Can you come to the final conclusion? So your simple answer for this question is no. So therefore, the auditor expected to perform audit procedures to obtain audit evidence. Remember, indication is not considered as an audit evidence. Indication එක කියන්නේ පුතේ evidence එකක් නෙමෙයි. While going through the indication, you need to perform audit procedures to obtain what? Sufficient and appropriate audit evidence for you to reach to the final conclusion. To reach to the final conclusion with regard to going concern. Okay, are we clear? Okay, are we clear on this?
Yes, sir.
Okay, anyone who is having any questions? Since this is a 1 hour or 1.5 hours revision session, so I'm not in a position to discuss all these theories in detail. I hope that in our physical class and in our online class, we have discussed all these in detail. And for the students who are joining for this class from other institute, I hope that they have discussed all these theoretical aspects. Right, so are we clear on these three standards which we discussed? So basically we discuss about SLAS 200, then we discuss about SLS 240, and we discuss about SLS 570 as well. Right. Okay. Okay, so can I erase the board from this side? Okay, so if you want to take a full picture, you can take a full picture. So I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes. Someone is asking questions. Under auditor's responsibility, you told auditor needs to have regular meetings with audit team. Here you reference to audit firm team members, right? Not the client audit team. So what do you mean by client audit team? Who raises this question? Hassan, right? Okay, so Hassan, what do you mean by client audit team? So you need to have regular intervals with your internal audit team. So including the engagement partner to the row junior level, you need to have a discussion. Hassan, have I answered to your question?
Yes, sir, I got it.
Okay, good. Right, so let me erase SLS 200 segment. Right. Okay, coming back to another critical auditing standard, SLAS 500. Audit evidence. One of the key standards in your syllabus. Audit evidence. Right. So when we are discussing about audit evidence, there are few areas that you needed to be highlighted. So the final objective of the auditor is to come to the audit opinion. The final objective of the auditor is to express his audit opinion. When the auditor is going to express his audit opinion, there are instances you will be come to conclusions. You need to come to several conclusions. So your final objective is to express the independent opinion, but when you are driving yourself towards to that opinion, there are instances where you need to come to several conclusions as well. Then the concern arises, can you come to the final conclusion or final audit opinion without having informations in your hand? No, you need to have informations in your hand. Those informations are referred as what? Audit evidences. Those informations are referred as what? Audit evidences. So basically, audit evidences are defined as information which has been obtained by the auditor when derived into the audit opinion and when come to the conclusions where the opinion is based on. So therefore, audit evidence is having two characteristics. Number one, audit evidence has to be sufficient. Number two, it has to be appropriate. Sufficient and appropriate. So what do you mean by sufficient? It is basically measurable. Which is basically measurable. Appropriateness basically includes 3 points. Number 1, relevance, reliability, and the quality. In simple language, this is referred as RRQ. Relevant, reliability, and the quality, which is not measurable. Not measurable. Not measurable. So in simple language, sufficient is considered as quantitative, whereas appropriateness is referred as qualitative. Quantitative and qualitative. But when we are deriving to the final opinion, you need to obtain audit evidences in combination of sufficient and appropriate both. Clear? Right. Then we discuss about methods to obtain audit evidences. Methods to obtain audit evidences. Methods to obtain audit evidences. Okay, so when we are discussing about methods to obtain audit evidences, there are 3 methods to obtain audit evidences. Number 1, risk assessment procedures. Risk assessment procedures. In simple language, this is referred as RAP. Risk assessment procedures. Number 2 is referred as test of controls. Test of controls, which is referred as TOC. And number 3 is referred as substantive procedures. Substantive procedures. In simple language, this is referred as SP. Okay, you have risk assessment procedures, you have test of controls and substantive procedures. Right, risk assessment procedures are mainly focusing on what? Audit risk. We had a deep dive on all these in our class. Test of controls are mainly focusing on what? Existence, effectiveness, and continuity of internal controls. Internal controls. This is basically defined as operating effectiveness. Operating effectiveness. Whereas substantive procedures are mainly focusing on what? Financial statement assertions. Financial statement assertions. So those are the main 3 methods to obtain audit evidences. Clear? Right. Then, under all these 3 methods, there are several procedures. Several procedures to obtain audit evidences. Under all these 3 methods, there are several procedures to obtain audit evidences. So what are those procedures? Number 1, inspection. Inspection. So inspection basically segregated into 2. Number 1, fixed asset inspection. Number 2, document inspection. Fixed asset inspection and document inspection. Then number 2, observation. Observation. Number 3, questionnaires and confirmations. Number 4, recalculations. Then analytical review procedures. And finally, reperformance. These are the procedures which we discuss to obtain audit evidences. So remember, all these procedures will be fallen into all these three categories. So you have risk assessment procedures, test of controls, and substantive procedures as key three methods to obtain audit evidence. Within these three key methods, there are 7 audit procedures as well. So inspection is segregated into fixed asset inspection and document inspection. So there are 2. Observation number 3, questionnaire number 4, confirmation number 5, recalculation number 6, analytical review procedures ARP number 7, and reperformance considered as number 8. So there are 8 procedures to obtain audit evidences. Right. Then when we are discussing audit evidences, another key theory which we discuss is audit risk. We discuss about audit risk. So audit risk is basically equals to what? A risk of material misstatements, multiplied by detection risk. Risk of material misstatements multiplied by detection risk. Then when you talk about risk of material misstatements, again further segregated into 2. Inherent risk plus control risk. So when you look at from the broader perspective, there are 3 components of audit risk: inherent risk, control risk, and detection risk. But when you look at from the bird view, there are 2 elements of audit risk: risk of material misstatements multiplied by detection risk. Then another theory which we discuss is what? The reliability of audit evidences. Reliability of audit evidences. So when we talk about the reliability of audit evidences, we discuss the reliability of audit evidences mainly depends on what? Mainly depends on auditor's professional judgment. Auditor's professional judgment. So the reliability of the audit evidences mainly depends on what? Auditor's professional judgment. But the standard basically emphasizing 5 important examples. First one, as an auditor, you need to obtain audit evidences as much as possible from which sources? External sources. Number 2, you need to obtain all these audit evidences as much as possible in a direct form. Number 3, you need to obtain all these audit evidences in written format rather than you accepting verbal audit evidences. Then number 4, you need to obtain audit evidences as much as possible from original documents. You're okay to accept a photocopy, but provided that you see the original. Then number 5, if the internal control systems are effective, auditor can obtain evidence through business organization. So those are the main examples which we discuss when we are discussing about the reliability of the audit evidences. Finally, we discuss about factors to be considered when deciding the sufficient and appropriateness of audit evidence. So there are 4 factors to be considered. Number 1, materiality of the item. That is number 1. Then the source of the audit evidence. Number 3, evaluation with regard to inherent risk, control risk, and accounting and internal control systems. Finally, auditor's experience and knowledge of the business. So these are the main key factors as an auditor that you need to focus when you're obtaining sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. So this mastermind map will give you a clear understanding with regard to one of the key auditing standards which is frequently tested at the exam, which is CL1 500. Okay, are we clear?
Sir, excuse. Hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, can you explain the re-performance with some example?
So re-performance is basically considered as a test of control. So where, let's say, the company is having a internal control system where the auditor wanted to check whether that is effectively implemented or not. So in that context, auditor will re-perform that internal control to check the operating effectiveness of the internal control.
All right, okay, sir.
Right. Okay, any other further questions? So basically we discuss SLAS 200, then we discuss about 240, 570 and 500. So main 4 standards we have done. Any questions? Okay, any other questions while I'm erasing the board? Sorry? So can you explain the inherent risk with an example? So Hassan, inherent risk is the risk where there is a possibility of having material misstatements in the financials, provided that the business organization is not having any internal controls. අපි company internal controls නැහැ කියන උපකල්පනයේ ඉඳගෙන බැලුවොත් මූල්‍ය වාර්තා තුළ material misstatements ඇතිවීමේ possibility එක තමයි කියන්නේ inherent risk කියන. So it is basically a professional assessment of the auditor. Have I give the answer to you?
Yeah, sir. Thank you.
Right, okay. Right, another key auditing standard. SLAUS 505. External confirmations. External confirmations. බාහිර තහවුරු කිරීම. Right. Okay, so when we are talking about external confirmations, there are few areas to be recognized. Number one, definition of external confirmations. I'm not going to write all these definitions now. In the slide, I have basically drafted the definition as well. So then you need to learn the definition of external confirmations. So when you're talking about external confirmations, there are two methods to call for confirmations. When we're talking about external confirmation, there are two methods to call for confirmations. Number one, it's a positive confirmation request. Positive confirmation request. Number two, negative confirmation request. There are two methods to obtain request external confirmations. Positive confirmation request plus the other one is what? Negative confirmation request. So what do you mean by positive confirmation request? Positive confirmation request again further segregated into two. Number one, without confirming the client balance. Without confirming the client balance. Client ke balance එක නොකිය ආන්න පුළුවන් confirmation එක. Number two, while confirming the client balance. Client balance. So with information and without information. Without confirming the client balance, you can ask the third party the balance, or while confirming your balance, you can request a third party to inform their balance as well. Here, as an auditor, you are expecting a feedback. You are expecting a feedback whether the balance is in agreement or not. You are expecting a balance confirmation whether the balance is in agreement or not. But in negative confirmation request, auditor only expecting the confirmation only if the balance is not in agreement. That is the difference. In positive confirmation request, whether you agreed or not, or whether you mention the balance or not, you are expecting the third party to reply to you. But when you consider about the negative confirmation request, you are expecting the third party to send you the confirmation letter if the balance is not in agreement. So that is the difference between positive confirmation and negative confirmation request. Then when you compare these two, positive confirmation request is considered as more reliable method to obtain a confirmation from a third party, because here you are not giving any options to third parties. Third party option එකක් දෙන්නේ නැහැ. කොහොම හරි ඔයා balance එක confirm කරගන්නයි බලන්නේ. But here you are giving an option to third parties. What is the option? You are expecting the third parties to confirm their balance if their balance is not in agreement with your balance. Clear? Then finally, we discuss about what if the management not authorizing the auditor to obtain written confirmations. Management එක auditor written confirmation ගන්න උඩ දුන්නේ නැත්නම් මොකද වෙන්නේ? This is basically leads to a scope limitation where you need to know the justification, and you need to perform what? Alternative procedures. You need to perform alternative procedures. So these are the main key highlights which comes under SLAUS 505, which is external confirmations. Are we clear on this? Any questions? Right. Okay. We will be discussing SLAUS 560 subsequent events. Right. So when we are discussing about subsequent events, first thing that you need to know is the definition. Definition of subsequent events. So what is the definition? So I'm not going to repeat the definitions again because in our theory class which we discuss, and for the benefit of the students who are joining today who are not coming to our class, I have given the slide as well so that you can refer it. Right. So the definition of subsequent events you need to understand clear. Then when you talk about subsequent events, basically the standard segregated into three categories. Subsequent events. There are three segments in this standard. What is number one? Number one, events occurring after the reporting date. But prior to audit report date. That is number one. Events occurring after the reporting date but prior to audit report date. Here, audit is having a proactive responsibility. Audit is having a proactive responsibility. Audit is having a proactive responsibility. Since the auditor is having the proactive responsibility, auditor has to obtain audit evidences while performing audit procedures. Auditor has to obtain audit evidences while performing audit procedures. Then you need to take a call whether that is an adjusting event or a non-adjusting event. Whether it is adjusting event or non-adjusting event. Then the second segment of the standard, facts known to the auditor after the audit report date, but prior to release financial statements to third parties. Prior to release of financial statements to third parties. Here, the main responsibility vested with management. Management responsibilities there. Then, the auditor's responsibility starts. Clear? Right. Then the third segment. Facts known to the auditor once the financial statements issued to third parties. Financial statements තුන්වන පාර්ශ්වයට ගියාට පස්සේ දැනගත්තොත් මොකද වෙන්නේ? Again the same thing. Management is having the primary responsibility. Then afterwards, auditor's responsibility starts. Both these occasions, both these instances, similar procedures. Similar procedures to perform with minor changes. Right. Okay, so this is basically the snapshot of SLAS 560, which is basically audit evidence. Right. Okay, going back to the final two topics. SLAUS 230 audit documentation. Audit documentation. Again, a standard which has been frequently tested at the exam. Okay, here you need to know the definition of audit documents. Audit documents. So audit documents can be prepared by the auditor. Audit documents විගණක කවරයාට හදන්න පුළුවන්. If not, by the management. Number 3, by third parties as well. Audit documents can be prepared by the auditor, by management, and third parties as well. Then you need to learn about the advantages if not factors to be included in audit evidence. Factors to be included in audit documents. audit documents. So there are 4. Number 1, information related to planning of the audit. Planning. Number 2, information relating to nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures. Number 3, audit evidences obtained. Number 4, conclusions reached. So those are the main content of the audit documents. Then you need to learn the advantages of audit evidence. Audit documents. Advantages of audit documents. In our theory class, we discuss about 3 advantages. Then form and content of audit evidence, audit documents. Form and content of audit documents. So there is a classic example which has been given in our theory tute. An auditor not having any previous experience should have the ability to obtain an overall understanding with regard to the audit. Up to that extent, the auditor has to prepare the documentation. An auditor who is not having any previous experience should have the ability to obtain an overall understanding with regard to the audit. So up to that extent, the auditor has to prepare the documentation. Then we discuss about audit file. So basically audit file segregated into 2. Number 1, current audit file, which contain the information which is applicable for the current financial year. Number 2, permanent audit file, which contain the information which is applicable for the current financial year plus the future years. Then finally we discuss about the ownership of documents and confidentiality. Okay, so those are the main segments which we discuss under SLS 230 as well. Right. Okay, so we discuss SLS 200, 240, 570, 500, 505, 560, and 230 as well. Finally, there is another small standard which is basically 580, which is written representation. So I do include a separate slide for that as well, so that you can refer that slide for your further informations. Clear? Right. So basically the session is to give you what you call an overall understanding with regard to the 8 critical auditing standards which has been tested very frequently at your exam. So the end objective of this session is to give a value addition to the students who are basically coming to our classes physically and online, and for all other students who are basically self-studying and going to other institutions as well. So as JMC, our end objective is to see all the students are basically passing the exam. So that is why we basically had a free session open to all the students, so that you will be getting a overall understanding with regard to the key standards which we discussed. Right. So I hope I have met the objectives of this session, and I'm be very open. I don't have I don't have the time to discuss all these theoretical aspects in this session like the way which we discuss in our theory session. So basically we spent almost 2 months to discuss all these standards in detail in our physical and online class. So just a thought of me doing this session for benefit of the students and to create value addition as well. So when you are studying, despite whether you are coming to JMC or not, if you do have a concern with regard to a theoretical aspects, okay, I'll give my number to you so that you can call me at any given point of time. So not 775 421 927 and not 779 539 969. So these are the two numbers where you can contact me. So if you do have any questions with regard to the theories, despite whether you are coming for JMC or whether you are going anywhere else or whether you are doing your self-studies, you can reach to me with these two numbers and you can WhatsApp me as well. So then when the time permits, I'll reply to you for the questions which you have raised. So then apart from that, just to inform that we will be starting a revision program. We will be starting a revision program for all our main subjects. So which will be scheduled to start on March final week, I think. Yeah, so which is scheduled to start on March final week. So we are inviting all the students who are basically wanted to pass this exam, because this would be the final chance for the all syllabus. So and I'll be very open to you. So the new syllabus is quite complex and quite comprehensive. So you need to give your best shot to complete your exam under the existing syllabus as much as you can. And we will be starting the revision program from 24th onwards, and it will continue for a period of 2 months, where we basically planning to discuss 5 model papers, including FRG, then my subject Advanced Audit and Assurance, then management accounting as well for corporate level, and we will be having the classes for strategic as well. So I hope the 1.5 hours which I spent with all of you is give a reasonable value addition to all of you. And I'm repeating this again and again. I don't have the freedom to discuss all these theories in detail within this 1.5 hours time, but I try to maximize the time. And I hope you will be getting an overall understanding with regard to the 8 standards which we discussed for today. And I'm planning to conduct another session closer to the exam as well. So I'll let you know the date so that you can join for that class as well. So I basically mentioned my contact numbers as well. And if you need any clarifications, if you need any support with regard to exam, please do not hesitate to contact me at any given point of time. Right. So we'll wind up the session for the day, and I wish you all the very best for the exams, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Good night.
Thank you, sir. Good night.